Welcome to the seventh in our series on the question of institutional corruption. My name is, well, if you don't know my name by now, then it's not going to help if I tell you again, but my name is Lawrence Lessig. I'm a professor of law at the law school and director of the Edmund J. Safra Foundation Center for Ethics at Harvard. This talk is the penultimate in our series. The final will be given in 2.5 weeks on April 22nd by Professor Simon Johnson from MIT on the question of the financial mess. Now, in many ways, I have been thinking about this talk since I began planning the work of this series and the work of this center. For in the not quite vast enough array of extraordinarily powerful thinkers who are currently focused on the particular dynamic at the core of the research of this center, there is no one else as insightful and as inciting and as rewarding to study as Bob Reich. I have a vivid memory of a breakfast in Berkeley when I first described the project of the center to him. It's a vividness enhanced by the extraordinary light of Berkeley in the morning. It took me just 3 minutes to describe the project, and then for the balance of the hour, Bob outlined, mapped for me every single issue that has been at the center of the focus of our work this year and for the next 4 years. Robert Reich is currently a professor of public policy at the University of California in Berkeley. Before that, he was at Brandeis and here at Harvard. He has published 14 books, including most recently Supercapitalism, and has contributed widely to scholarly and public policy debate. He was America's 22nd Secretary of Labor. Time magazine says he was one of America's top cabinet officials of that century, not this century. He attended Dartmouth, where he received his bachelor's degree, Oxford, where he received a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics, and the Yale Law School, where he received a degree which we Yaleys like to pass off as a law degree. He is something of a hero of mine, for he has done 3 things that are difficult, and if the numbers matter, one might say practically impossible. First, he has been an important scholar framing and reframing how we all think about critical issues of scholarship and public policy. Second, he has been an important public citizen, serving his government, trying to serve as governor, and constantly focusing his energy on helping fellow citizens get public policy right. Now, these 2 things many of us try to do, but it's the third thing which he has done which I think is the hardest. He has done both of these things, being a scholar, being a public citizen, in the most difficult way personally that one can do that. He has criticized his friends. He has a party, but he is not a party man. He has forced himself into positions that are obviously correct, but impossibly difficult to sustain. In a word, he has done both of these things with integrity. Now, it is the aspiration to that integrity that is the subject of his lecture tonight, not so much at the individual level, but at the level of professions. And it is with enormous pleasure and gratitude that I ask you to join me in welcoming back to Harvard, Robert Reich.
Well, thank you, Larry. Well, thank you, Larry. What a lovely introduction. I will not live up to it, I promise you, tonight. First of all, let me thank Larry, and let me thank the Safra Center for inviting me, and thank all of you for coming, and all of your interest in this question, this very central question of corruption, institutional corruption, which is very closely related to a question that has dogged me for years, and that has to do with the declining confidence and trust of Americans in all our major institutions, but particularly in our political institutions. I'm going to get to professions, hopefully if we have enough time, but I want to talk primarily about declining trust in politics and in democracy. I think it's very closely related to a phenomenon that I have borne witness to over the years, and that phenomenon is, in turn, one of money. money in politics. Now, maybe I ought to start, and I'm going to get probably back to my formal text, but I'll just give you some autobiographical background. I came to Washington for the first time in 1967. I was an intern to Senator Robert Kennedy. I was dazzled by Washington, even though Washington at that time was very close to what Robert Kennedy's brother, President Kennedy, had described as a city that had all of the charms of a northern industrial city and all of the efficiency and convenience of a small southern town. It struck me that way in 1967. My own duties, to the extent that they're relevant, I don't think they are, my duty was to run Bobby Kennedy's signature machine. And I did that all summer long. At that time, signature machines were long wooden arms. They had a pen stuck in the end of it, and you pressed a button, and the long wooden arm with a pen stuck in it, if you positioned the letter exactly correctly that was going to a constituent or whomever from Robert Kennedy, that long arm with that pen in it would spell out Robert F. Kennedy. And I got it just right. It took me about 3 days to learn, but then after about 6 weeks or 7 weeks on the job, I got a bit bored. To tell you the truth, I got very bored. In fact, I got so bored that late at night I would type letters to my friends on Robert F. Kennedy stationery. And then I would creep into the signature room and I would write a signature on them. They were innocent enough. Dear Mr. Dworkin, congratulations for having the largest nose in New York State, Robert F. Kennedy. And there are these, and they are now, they're collector's items. I don't know if you can get them on eBay, but they are around. One day, however, I think this does have a bearing on this particular lecture. One day, I hadn't seen the senator really much during the summer. Interns didn't expect to see the people they worked for. But one day, he came out of the elevator. I just happened to be there at the moment on my way to the signature machine. The elevators opened, and there were people on both sides of him, his aides, very powerful aides, and they were whispering into his ear, and I stood there in awe as he came out of the elevator. I was very idealistic about government. I was in awe of Robert F. Kennedy. He looked at me for a moment. I froze, and he said, "How are you doing, Bob?" He knew my name. I said, "Fine, Senator," and then he went off, and I think that I would have, on the basis of that interchange, run his signature machine for the next 6 months. But then, toward the end of that summer, I and another intern working for Jacob Javits organized a protest against Vietnam, and we got every intern on the Hill to sign up that protest letter against the war. It was 1967, and I remember being called into Kennedy's office. I thought he was going to be delighted, and he sat me down. He said, "I understand you're one of the organizers of this petition." I said, "Yes, Senator, I am." I had a big smile on my face. And he said, "Stop it." I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "I want you to stop organizing. I want your name off of this. I don't want any connection with this whatsoever. Do you hear me?" And he was angry. And I said, "Yes." He said, "Now get out." Well, that was my first experience with Washington politics. I asked his administrative assistant what was going on, and the administrative assistant said, "Look, the senator is having enough problems with Lyndon Johnson right now. He doesn't need you to add to them." Washington, I learned, was a more complicated place than I had thought. Well, the important part of this story, however, is not so much the complexity of Washington, it's that Washington was also a very seedy place. I came back to Washington again in the 1970s. I was working for Robert Bork. Nobody knows that, but I worked in the Solicitor General's office. I was assistant to the Solicitor General. I worked for Robert Bork. It was a good job. I enjoyed the job, even though Robert Bork and I disagreed, I guess, on the first Second, Fourth, Fifth, Eighth, and Ninth Amendments to the Constitution. But although we did disagree, he was a very good boss. But let me tell you something. I then immediately went on to the Federal Trade Commission. And by that time, Jimmy Carter was president. And by that time, I started to get lobbied. Now, I had never been lobbied before. This was a new experience for me. People would call me on the phone, say that they represented this industry or that particular company, and they wanted to have lunch with me. And I didn't want to be impolite, and I didn't want to hang up. And so I said, well, all right, let's have lunch. But the lunch place I chose, almost instinctively, was a little lunch place right across Pennsylvania Avenue from the Federal Trade Commission. It was known as Barney's. Barney's is not there anymore, which is part of my story. Barney's was distinguished in those days for its very bad sandwiches, and it's also its abundance of cockroaches. After one lunch with me at Barney's, I would never see that lobbyist again. I learned that that was a good way of controlling the influence of lobbying on the Federal Trade Commission. I urged my friends, also working in the Federal Trade Commission, to use it became known as the Barney's technique for dealing with lobbyists. I went back to Washington again in the 1990s as Secretary of Labor. Barney's was gone. In fact, Washington looked very different. Washington, along with Pennsylvania Avenue, but not just Pennsylvania Avenue, K Street, H Street, all of the avenues, they had become much wealthier. They glittered. The hotels were absolutely beautiful. The restaurants that had been in the 1960s rather seedy, even in the 70s were a little bit better. In the 80s, when I occasionally went down, were better still. By the 1990s, they were fabulous. Heavy napkins. Not only linen, but also that heavy silverware. You know, the heavy silverware you use, you can hardly pick it up. It's filled with lead, and waiters and people at the doors of these restaurants, and also every place else, opening the door and smiling, and the service was extraordinary. The glass, the beauty, the carpets. Washington, in short, had become a place, a town filled with money. I saw it happen over 3 or 4 decades. And every time I go down to Washington now, in fact, I was there 2 days ago, I am shocked once again because the glitter and the money, the beauty of the restaurants and of the hotels is even greater than it was before. Where is all this money coming from? I naively used to ask myself. Well, I know the answer to that, and you do too. It's coming because money has been rushing into Washington over the last 35, 40 years, escalating. And that's the critical question that I want to discuss with you today. The escalation of money into Washington. Why? And what does that have to do with democracy? And what does that have to do with corruption? And what does that have to do with the decline of public trust? Most of the polls that show a decline of public trust in Washington start in the 1960s. And the typical poll, and you have seen these polls, I'm sure, in this seminar or this lecture series, perhaps you've already gone over them. One poll that I like very much is run by the Survey Research Center, and it asks the same question every year. It asks, do you trust your representatives in Washington to do what is best for the country or what is best for particular interests? In the 1960s, about 2/3 of Americans consistently said they trusted their representatives in Washington to do what was best for the country. That percentage kept on dropping through the 60s and 70s and 80s until by the late 90s it had reversed itself. By the late 90s, more than 60% said they expected their representatives in Washington to do what is best for special interests, and only a small percentage. Less than 30% believed that their representatives in Washington would act in the public's interest. Now, a whole variety of reasons have been given for declining trust in our public institutions, and in Congress, and in the White House, and in our government in general. And we could come up with several. I mean, one obvious theory is that Vietnam and Watergate and Iran-Contra and a whole series of events that have disillusioned Americans with Washington have taken place, and one after another have had a cumulative effect. Trust has declined because people have learned not to trust Washington. That is certainly one school of thought. It's difficult to pin down with any accuracy whether this is more important than others, but it is clearly one factor. Another view holds that there was a very special period of time, starting around 1929, 30, 31, 32, certainly by the time Franklin D. Roosevelt got to Washington in 1933, starting with the Great Depression, and moving through World War II, in which the public felt it had to trust Washington. We were all in it together. Social solidarity was mandatory, and Washington represented necessarily what the nation aspired to. We had no choice. We were together in these great, deep social conflicts, political, worldly conflicts. But that was an exception. This view holds that was an exception, that this country is founded on distrust, distrust of our political institutions. That was the way the founders designed the United States, designed it on distrust, separation of powers, checks and balances, difficult to get anything done. And that was an exceptional period between 1933 and the end of the Second World War. It carried over a little bit into the 50s and 60s because there was a generational memory of that period. But once that generational memory had faded, then there was a kind of reversion back to the norm. Well, undoubtedly, that has something to do, or could have something to do with the decline of trust. But I want to suggest to you that there is something else going on. And it has to do with the structural change in our economy. A structural change that may explain why all this money has come into Washington. And all this money, in turn, has reduced the public's confidence that its representatives are working on its behalf and not on behalf of some special moneyed interest. Now, I should mention here that in the 1950s, in the wake of the Second World War, in the wake of our experience, our fresh experience with fascism and Soviet communism, there was a great deal of interest among political scientists in what made democracy in the United States actually work. And at that time, you had Robert Dahl, and then later Nelson Polsby and others develop a notion of pluralism. Pluralism. That is, it wasn't as if we had direct democracy, but rather our representatives were responding to a multiplicity of groups, overlapping groups, competing groups. And we, as citizens, belonged to 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 of those groups, and somehow, because there were these intermediary groups between our representatives and us that generally reflected, because of the competition and overlap of those groups, what we individually wanted, because we belonged to at least one, if not more, of those groups. John Kenneth Galbraith put it in a slightly different way with his theory of countervailing power in the new industrial state. The idea that the New Deal had created countervailing centers of economic power. You had big business and small retailers protected by certain laws that protected them against resale price maintenance. You had the development of labor unions under the National Labor Relations Act, countervailing against the power of the largest corporations, and so forth. Not all that different from pluralism. In the 1950s and early 1960s, this concept, pluralism and the postscript of countervailing power, explained to us why democracy worked. It gave ballast, in a way, to our notion that our representatives, even though we understood they could not reflect our interests directly, were indirectly reflecting our interests. But then came what? Well, there are various theories about why the escalation of money. Before I get to my theory, having to do with the structural change of the economy, I probably should review very quickly what these other theories are. One holds that large corporations became larger and gained more market power. And as they became larger and gained more market power, they became better able, because they had so much more money and greater earnings, they became better able to influence the political process. Now, that was the theory that I first understood when I became sort of a radical in the late 1960s. Hardly a radical, sort of a Democrat. But the problem with that theory is that you look very closely, and it turns out, and I'll get to this in a moment, that although companies did become larger, the economy became more globalized, and many of our big firms became larger, there is very little evidence to suggest that their return on investment was higher, or that they gained market power. In fact, if anything, the evidence suggests that they lost market power. If anything, the evidence suggests that in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s, the economy was organized around a relatively few companies in every industry. Each of these companies did have quite substantial oligopolistic power because there were few of them. The economy was based on high volume, standardized, stable mass production, economies of scale, and around these companies were many small suppliers, but also very large labor unions. And labor unions gained their power and legitimacy not just from the 1935 National Labor Relations Law that allowed the organizing to occur, but also in the 1950s because these large oligopolies could so easily pass on the additional costs of higher unionized wages to consumers. And because every one of them did exactly the same, and because unions were organized by industry, it was very easy for these large oligopolistic unions to accept unions without any injury to their competitive position. So in fact, if anything, with the decline of those oligopolies, with structural change, again, which I'll get to in a minute, this first theory that companies have grown more powerful in terms of their market power, and that market power translates into political power, and that explains the escalation of money in politics, holds very little water. Which gets us to theory two. Theory two is that politicians have somehow, over the last 30 or 40 years, become less principled. They have lost their ethical moorings. Politicians are more in it for themselves. Now, I know of no empirical study that suggests that politicians are less ethical or more corrupt today, more eager to accept money that promotes either their own advancement or their own job security or even their own bank accounts than they were 30 or 40 years ago. Our political history is rife with stories of either formal or informal corruption. In fact, by my experience and by my readings, I would say over the last 30 or 40 years, our politicians have been actually less corrupt in those meanings of the term, taking money directly, taking bribes. Remember, it was the era of the robber barons in which, in the 1890s and 1900s, we had the railroad magnates and the oil magnates hiring people to put bags of money down on legislatures' desks in Congress, in the Senate and the House of Representatives. Bribery is, at least direct bribery, is much less common today than ever before. There are perhaps no fewer or more rotten apples in Congress than there ever were before, but there are more rotten headlines than ever before. How can we explain that? Well, there is another theory about the escalation of money. Remember, I'm talking about the escalation of money. I don't hold to this theory. It was very popular until the beginning of the Obama administration. The theory is it's all the Republicans. It's the K Street Project. It's Tom DeLay. They all began this extraordinary dance with major lobbyists, and they are responsible for money coming into Washington as never before. Well, it's a convenient theory for Democrats, and I would like to say that if I have my partisan hat on, that there was some truth to it. But again, look at the evidence, and there's almost no truth to it at all. Both parties have been at the till, as it were. Both parties have been seeking campaign contributions to a greater and greater extent. In fact, if anything, it was the Democrats who began going to companies, going to trade associations in the 1970s and 1980s. Tony Coelho, when he was head of the Democratic, I believe it was the Congressional Campaign Committee, began very large-scale efforts to solicit money from companies. And everyone knows that Bill Clinton, my former boss when he was in the White House, was extremely solicitous of big businesses that could provide money. The Lincoln bedroom became a notorious place. In fact, it was one of the only places where the old adage could be confirmed that the White House is the only hotel where it's the guests who leave the mint on the pillow. Roger Tamraz, some of you may remember. Anybody remember Roger Tamraz? How quickly they forget. Roger Tamraz, he was an oil tycoon. He gave the Democratic National Committee $300,000 in order to meet with President Clinton, just for a mere handshake, which prompted Republican Senator Fred Thompson to ask Tamra at a congressional hearing over money flowing into the Democrats' coffers during congressional hearings on campaign finance reform, whether he thought, that is Tamraz, thought that he had a constitutional right to have your business deal considered personally by the President of the United States. To which Tamraz responded with remarkable candor, Senator, I go to the outer limits. Why not? You set the rules, and we're following. This is politics as usual. You set the rules. Upon leaving office, I should say, more than half of the officials, not cabinet solely, but sub-cabinet and appointed officials of the Clinton administration went into lobbying. The Republicans have no monopoly on seeking money or having money seek them in politics. All right, what about another theory, a very common theory, and that is that it's simply bigger government. Bigger government has brought on more money. Here's a comment from former Republican House Speaker Newt Gingrich. He says, there's $2.6 trillion spent in Washington with the authority to regulate everything in your life. So guess what? People will spend unheard of amounts of money to influence that. The underlying problems are big government and big money. In other words, the escalation is simply a function of government getting much larger. This view, although, again, it's convenient with some politicians, again, is not really borne out by the facts. Apart from the extraordinary economic crisis that we have just endured, which has indeed caused government to grow, as the business cycle would presumably, any Keynesian would say, would require and appropriately require government to grow, the largest increases in post-war public spending at all levels of government occurred between 1947 and 1973, before the period we are now talking about. As a percentage of the total economy, federal outlays peaked in 1983 at around 24% and then declined steadily to 20%. Now, meanwhile, throughout this period, more and more of the federal budget has gone to Social Security and also to Medicare and national defense. And although there are lobbyists who cluster around Social Security, not many, and there definitely are lobbyists who cluster around Medicare and certainly around national defense, non-defense discretionary, where you'd expect most lobbying, because these are the particular appropriations bills that have got to be enacted every year, year by year. That peaked in 1980, non-defense discretionary, at 5.2% of the national economy and has declined every year since then. Due to the overall growth of the economy, federal spending certainly has increased, but the flow of corporate money into Washington has escalated much faster. Now, some say that the escalation can be explained by regulations. There's been just a huge, colossal increase in regulations. I will get to some regulations in a moment, healthcare reform, a special case, and so on. But as measured by the number of final or proposed rules published in the Federal Register, regulation actually declined between 1980 and 2008. Now, regulations arguably have become more complex. And I remember both as Secretary of Labor and also when I was at the Federal Trade Commission dealing with the issue of regulatory complexity. And I had a very difficult time. You don't even know the meaning of the word frustration until you've tried to simplify federal regulations. But I want to assure you that the difficulty in simplifying the regulations came about because of corporate lobbyists. And why is that? Because every time the regulations were simplified, it was easier for the lobbyists and also the corporate affairs people to find or create a new loophole. And that loophole had to be filled, creating more complexity. In other words, complexity was the result of the lobbyists. It wasn't that the lobbyists were responding to the complexity, if you get my drift. There is one final theory about why the escalation, and that is that corporations have had to respond to greater and greater unionization and union strength. Now, anybody who knows what's happened to the American labor union movement knows that that can't possibly be a reason. It is still being offered as a reason. But when I was Secretary of Labor, the AFL-CIO on Capitol Hill had 3 full-time lobbyists. 3. Today, the AFL-CIO on Capitol Hill has 4 full-time lobbyists. Now, to give you a sense of proportion, under financial reform and the financial reform processes and deliberations and laws that are now coming forth from the House and also from the Senate Finance Committee, the Senate Banking Committee, you have, at least according to Larry Summers, who I talked with about this a couple of days ago, you have 4 lobbyists for every member of Congress. That's the ratio. 4 lobbyists from the financial community, I should say, for every member of Congress. So compare that to the 4 lobbyists in total for the AFL-CIO. You know, I had a graduate student recently do a survey, and he's putting the survey into a thesis. He went to every major lobbyist and lobbying organization in Washington. He went to every major trade association in Washington. He went to every major industrial group in Washington and every major company that had a lobbying presence in Washington. And he administered a very simple survey. And in the survey, the question simply was, who is your major opponent in most of the fights you engage in Washington over the last year? And they listed their major opponent or major opponents. In every single case, their major opponent was another company or industry. In not even one case was their major opponent either labor or, for that matter, a so-called public interest group. Are you trying to get a picture? The escalation has been almost entirely corporate money. It's not only been corporate PACs, political action committees, but it's also been increasingly bundled money from corporate executives and employees. And of course, money going to special groups that have been set up under the tax laws to mount political campaigns, ostensibly without coordination of any particular campaign. Now, the real reason for the arms race is this. At least this is my theory. As we have gone from high-volume, standardized, stable production, as the economy has moved from the model of competition that dominated between the 1930s and the 1960s, which was oligopolistic. Major automakers, 3. Major chemical manufacturers, 5. Major television networks, 3. Major telephone company, 1. And we could go through the entire economy. It was either monopolistic or it was oligopolistic. 1 or 2 or 3 or sometimes 5 major players coordinating with each other informally and sometimes formally over pay, over investment, over tricky prices. Tricky because they couldn't do it overtly under the antitrust laws. But as we moved from that system to a very different system, competition intensified. Why did we move to a different system, a more competitive system? Why was there this great shift in the economy? It came about primarily, I believe, because of technology. Technologies of transportation, cargo ships, container ships, satellite communication technologies, which aided transportation and communication and enabled various pieces of the production process to be parceled out around the globe to wherever they could be done most cheaply. You also had technologies of production coming on stream. Technologies that automated more and more of the production process, allowed smaller companies to get footholds in major industries by tailoring their output and products to special high-value-added needs. For example, in the steel industry, economies of scale gave way to specialty steels that were molded or waxed or sealed for particular end uses. Chemicals, it's all specialty chemicals. Again, economies of scale giving way because technologies permitted it to a much more customized kind of product. You find also technologies allowing much greater diversity. Instead of 3 networks, there right now, when I last looked at television, there were 300 or so. I don't know how anybody any longer decides what they're going to watch on television. You look down the aisles of any particular store, food market, anywhere, you see a plethora of not only products but also companies globalization has allowed any company to get almost whatever supplies it needs without depending as much on economies of scale. The net result of all of this is that instead of competing on the basis of high volume, more and more companies in the United States are competing on the basis of high value. They are competing on the basis of innovation. In the entire technology sector of this economy, it is innovation that is driving competition. The barrier to entry is not scale. Anybody can enter. Anybody can get access almost to the same capital, almost to the same global resource and sourcing chains. Any particular company can get wherever it wants to as long as it has an innovative idea. Now, I am slightly overstating the case for the purpose of making my case, but the data are fairly clear on this. And if you want more, I refer you to an insightful little book now in paperback called Supercapitalism. But how does all of this relate to money and politics? It relates in the following way. I would say, and again, on the basis of the data and experience and observation, that companies are competing more intensely in the political arena for competitive advantage or to avoid competitive disadvantage than ever before. Take a look at healthcare. I've been doing some snooping around because healthcare has, like it has, I'm sure many of you, preoccupied me. But I've been looking particularly at which groups of industries or which companies are lobbying for what. Now, to the public, and given the kind of media coverage, the healthcare debate has looked like it's been the healthcare providers or maybe the drug companies and the insurers and the hospitals and doctors against who? Against the rest of us, against the public. But the closer you get to the actual debates, the actual behind-the-scenes drama, the skirmishes, the battles every day that went into creating the legislation and creating the various alternative pieces of legislation, and that will go into creating the regulations, because now all of those skirmishes and battles simply move over to HHS. The closer you get, you see that it's not a monolithic industry against the public interest. It's actually different companies and different industries and segments of industries pitted against each other. Doctors squabbled over whether primary care doctors would get a Medicaid payment boost or a somewhat smaller Medicaid payment boost would go to all doctors. This almost split the AMA, and it created all sorts of different lobbying among doctors. Health insurers that specialize in providing Medicare Advantage preferred that the growth of Medicare payments be slowed somewhat for all private plans, rather than slowed mostly by cutting Medicare Advantage plans, and the Medicare Advantage insurers in this battle, pitted against other insurers specializing in different kinds of plans, they lost. Insurers that specialize in higher cost plans, mainly going to unionized companies and mid-level executives, they obviously squared off against those that specialize in a different segment of the market, catering to lower wage workers on the question of whether taxes should be raised on high-cost plans and at what level the tax should kick in. And the lower-tier insurers won on that. Middle-sized companies fought against small employers over the size of businesses that would be exempt from the requirement of insuring their employees. Now, when you talk about small businesses in Washington, some small businesses do have their own trade associations. A few small businesses actually do have representatives in Washington. Some fall under the umbrella of the National Federation of Independent Businesses. But every time there is an umbrella group in Washington, if you get up close, you see that the trade association desperately tries to keep its members together. The NFIB was constantly prone to splits because different small businesses were affected differently by different aspects of the healthcare laws. Companies specializing in biologic drugs faced off against generic drug companies on the question of whether biologics deserved 12 extra years of patent protection. Different drug companies have different dependence on biologic drugs and therefore different competitive positions, and they were fighting like mad. The major drug lobbies were trying to keep that coalition together. They did not succeed always. In fact, many, many times, different aspects of the drug industry came and lobbied their own positions. Individual industries outside healthcare fought for benefits and exemptions. One clear winner: home and commercial builders. They do not have to comply with coverage mandates regardless of how many employees they have. On the larger question of who should bear what costs and get the most benefits, the pharmaceutical industry fought the health insurers, who in turn fought the hospitals. Now, overall, what we see in all of these negotiations and all of these bargains is that the industries, or the segments of industries, or the companies with most bargaining leverage get the best deals. Their bargaining leverage comes in part from the amount they've invested. The amount they've invested in political campaign contributions, the amount that they can threaten to withhold in political campaign contributions and extend to the other party, or possibly in a primary fight, other candidates. Also, their investments in public relations, also their investments in lawyers, who often double as lobbyists and who often carry their mantle or threaten to carry their mantle in regulatory proceedings. One thing you need to know is the data in all of this. All of this that I've given you is based on discussions I have had with people on the staffs of these committees. Data overall, a little bit hard to come by. For example, the lobbying, the data we have on the number of lobbyists in Washington is only registered lobbyists, not people who are advisors, consultants. Tom Daschle was not a registered lobbyist, for example. Most people in Washington who are doing and carrying the water of major companies or trade associations, they are not registered lobbyists. Now, as a practical matter, what this means is that the Obama administration, like previous administrations, have had to negotiate piecemeal with parts of the industry. The Obama administration learned a very important lesson from the Clinton administration in terms of health care. Bill Clinton did not understand what I am now telling you about the fissures, the divisions within industries and among industries, industry segments, and companies. He and we all, I was there at the time with regard to health care, were actually quite innocent, if not naive. President Obama benefited, you might say, from a group of people who had been through the Clinton healthcare wars and who understood the importance of striking deals and splitting industries and opposition as quickly and as early as possible. So, for example, one of the first things the Obama administration did very early on in healthcare was to get the acquiescence of the drug industry as a whole, and then continue to negotiate with different segments of the drug industry. That cost and will cost the drug industry about $80 billion over the next 10 years, but it will benefit the drug industry as a whole and certain segments of the drug industry, like biologic drugs, even more over the next 10 years. The cost, ultimately, will be borne by you and me. A similar thing is now occurring with regard to energy and environmental legislation. People wonder, why did the president strike the deal with oil on drilling rights last week? What's that all about? Well, my best guess is the administration is doing exactly the same as it did with healthcare. It is buying off particular pieces of an industry in terms of reducing the power of a particular coalition, in this case, particular aspects and powerful actors in the oil and drilling industry, to get them on its side. And we could go on. Financial regulation is a particularly interest of mine, and I'm not going to waste more of your time. In fact, I've got to come to a conclusion in the not-too-distant future about financial regulation. But with financial regulation, you can see exactly what is going on. The financial industry is being split. It is being split in many interesting ways. Commercial banks versus the largest Wall Street banks. Wall Street banks are being played against each other. They are playing against each other, and so far. The best example I have of the arms race, and by the way, this does resemble an arms race, is what happened to Google. Google, when I got out to California in 2005, I met with people from Google. I was just interested in their business strategy. They were up and coming. It was clear that they were going to be a dominant player in this amorphous space of communications and entertainment and search engines, and I was interested in understanding more. And I met with them, and they were very proud that they had nothing to do with Washington. They told me in 2005, we don't even have a Washington office. We don't have any lobbyists in Washington. We don't want anything to do with Washington. I was rather impressed in a way. Well, what happened to Google? Google went public. Actually, the conversations I stand corrected, were in 2003, because Google went public in 2004. It took pride in being a maverick outsider, but once it became a multi-billion-dollar public company, it needed to become part of the Washington establishment. In 2005, it spent more than $500,000 hiring lobbying firms and consultants, and opened its own office complex. Its executives and lobbyists began raising millions of dollars for political campaigns. Lauren Maddox, a woman who is in the lobbying firm of Podesta Mattoon. Anybody hear that lobbying firm, Podesta Mattoon? It's a very big and important lobby. It's very important. If you're interested in what is going on in Washington, you've got to know the major lobbyists and who they're working for. Podesta Mattoon was hired by Google. It is still Google's lobbyist. Lauren Maddox is one of the major representatives of Google through Podesta Mattoon on the Hill. She said, they are brilliant engineers, but they are not politicians, she said of Google. Podesta Mattoon is a bipartisan lobbying firm. They are all bipartisan these days. And that's exactly what Google needed. Anthony Podesta is a longtime Democrat, brother of John Podesta, formerly Bill Clinton's chief of staff. His partner, Daniel Mattoon, is a close friend of former Republican Speaker Dennis Hastert. And Maddox herself is a former top aide to Newt Gingrich. Google, by the way, had no choice. Yahoo, Microsoft, Apple, and a gaggle of telecom companies were already well represented in Washington. In 2005 alone, Microsoft spent almost $9 million in lobbying. Why? Because there are all of these issues governing intellectual property, international trade, antitrust. And if you are not there with your own fleet of lobbyists, and those lobbyists are in turn fronts for a great deal of political contributions you've made, you are going to lose out to your competitors. That's, you see, where the escalation comes from. That's where this kind of arms race is fundamentally based. There is no end to it, because most of these companies and most subsectors of industries are competing against each other. Competition is getting more and more intense. The battles that Google is in right now with Microsoft and Yahoo and others are finding their way through the regulatory process, through the federal courts, Let me give you another quote of Lauren Maddox. She says, "The policy process is an extension of the market battlefield." The policy process is an extension of the market battlefield. Well, yes, that's what she believes, and she's doing nothing illegal. By the way, I haven't indicated a single thing that is illegal. And that is the great scandal of all of it. Because as this money mounts, as administration after administration learns that it's got to make deals with particular companies, particular industries, side deals, payoffs, as we get more and more money in Washington pushing the price of everything higher, we see no end to it. 7 counties immediately surrounding Washington, 7 of those counties are among the 20 wealthiest counties, according to the U.S. Census, right now in the United States. 1970, 3% of retiring members of Congress went to work as lobbyists. Latest data I have from 3 years ago is that 30% went to work as lobbyists. Why are they now all working as lobbyists? Because they are unprincipled? Because they're bad people? No, because that's where the money is. 1970, there wasn't all that money in lobbying. It's the same wave of money that has created the glitter, the beautiful hotels, the gorgeous restaurants. It has raised everything in its wake, property values, the returns on lobbying, the returns on rents, commercial property. Everything is going up. The arms race has no ending point. And so the only way of restoring public trust in a democracy dominated, overwhelmingly dominated by money, it seems to me, is to get very serious about getting money out of politics, of ending the arms race. Now, here's the good news. If I'm correct about this arms race, it's not really in any company's or industry's interest. That is, arms races can be controlled when there are sufficient rules that make sure that nobody has an interest in continuing or escalating the arms race. De-escalation. It was interesting to me that the last round of campaign finance reform, McCain-Feingold, you had one major business group of CEOs committed to reducing the influence of money in politics and reducing the ability of essentially lobbyists to hold up companies for a great deal of money with the threat that they'll go someplace else if the company does not promise to do business with them, a form of extortion. And that major business lobbying group, it seems to me, is the kernel of something that we could possibly, those of us who are interested in reform, build on. My disappointment so far, and I've got to tell you this honestly, is that campaign finance reform and all of its ancillary reforms, even in light of Citizens United against the Federal Election Commission, a grotesque decision by the Supreme Court. But there's many things that can be done even in light of that decision. My great disappointment is not so much in that decision, it is disappointing, but it is that the Obama administration has not made campaign finance reform, getting money out of politics, lobbying reform, more central to its agenda. There is no way to restore confidence and trust in our democratic process unless we do a better job getting corporate money out of our democracy. Thank you very much. Okay.
I'll call on the questions. Okay, as is our convention, we have 2 mics. I will send the mics to people. We auction off who gets to ask the questions, appropriately enough. And then please signal to me and make sure you see that I see you, and we'll make sure the mic gets to you. So the first question, I don't see a hand yet, right here in the center. And the second question should have their hand up so I can make sure the mic gets to you, way in the back.
I was wondering, what precisely makes the political arena such a decisive site for market competition? How did that come about?
Question, why is the political arena such an important site for market competition? I think it is one site for market competition, and I think it comes about because of a simple fact, and that is that any rule or law or even legal decision that is neutral on its face is likely to affect different companies and different industries differently because their cost structures are different. And so if you are in a world of intense competition, if you are Google or Microsoft or any of the other examples I gave you in healthcare or any of the industries, any on its face neutral rule is likely to give you either a competitive advantage or your competitor a competitive advantage. And at the margin, because remember, the game is played at the margin, this becomes terribly important.
Aaron?
I'm Aaron Swartz. I'm a co-founder of the Progressive Change Campaign Committee and a fellow at the Center next year. I first want to commend you for focusing on the incredible transformation that happened in the 70s and 80s, and I agree is completely understudied. However, I do have a bit of a quibble with your theory that it's simply better technology that made the difference. For one thing, I wonder, why all of a sudden was this technology created in the 70s and 80s? We knew how to put things in boxes for many, many years. Why was it all of a sudden that at that period we realized that we could ship these boxes and have that be a much more efficient means? And the second point I want to raise is that technological changes that allowed new upstarts to compete with existing older firms is really only a small part of the transformation. The 70s and 80s, you'll recall, was the era of the hostile takeover, the leveraged buyout, the profitability crisis, shareholder activism, all sorts of mechanisms in addition to just enhanced competition from smaller firms that undermine the pressure, the kind of entrenched management that Galbraith talked about and allowed market competition to kind of take that place and create the super capitalism that you've described. So I'm kind of curious if there's something larger that causes both of those, and I'd been wondering about it for a while until I think just the other week my friend David Graywall said that his theory was what happened in the 70s and 80s was really, kind of the conclusive fall of the Soviet Union, that you had all sorts of people in the United States who controlled these, great collections of wealth and power that then own the shares in all of these corporations, who realized now there wasn't really a threat from an alternative, right? This was the era of there is no alternative. Capitalism was triumphant. Now there was nothing to be feared from having capitalism run wild and competition go as extreme as possible. If you read stuff from the 20s and 30s, business leaders and presidents and prime ministers are all talking about how we're worried that if we don't be nicer to the population, they'll all go Bolshevik. In the 70s and 80s, perhaps they realized, this is Graywall's suggestion, that this wasn't such of a problem anymore, that the alternatives had all failed and now capitalism could be unleashed.
There may be something to that, I don't know, but let me fill in some of the blanks that you suggested. For one thing, one of the big reasons for this technological balloon, this great wave in the 70s and 80s, particularly with regard to telecommunications and transportation, is an outgrowth of the Vietnam War, an outgrowth of military expenditures. For example, container ships really began with trying to get a lot of stuff to South Vietnam. The government invested substantially in infrastructure for great container ships, loading, unloading. The containers themselves, the original designs came out of the Pentagon, and these big container ships would go to Vietnam, to Cam Ranh Bay and other places. They would unload. They would be empty. A lot of it then was privatized. These empty containers would go up to Japan, load in Japanese products, and go back to the United States. That is the beginning of the first wave of modern Japanese competition because transportation costs plummeted after that. We also saw some major improvements coming out of the Defense Department in satellite communication technologies and other technologies that, again, allowed international coordination of production systems as never before. You mentioned one thing that I failed to mention, and I should have, and that is deregulation. Deregulation of many markets, including, importantly, financial markets, allowed a great deal of financial activity. In the 1980s, you alluded to junk bonds and takeovers. All of that financial entrepreneurialism that began in the 80s did put greater and greater pressure on companies to perform. That intensified competition, and that also lowered entry barriers. You're absolutely right about that.
You have a question here?
Yes, hello. My name is it on? Okay. My name is Andrew Hamill. I'm just passing through, and I was just very quickly wondering if you could talk about income inequality, increasing income inequality, possibly driving distrust with politics, and what are the causal arrows between income inequality, more money in Washington, and distrust in politics?
Well, if I had had time, I would have got to that portion of my paper. Besides corporate influence in Washington, there is, I believe, and again, I provide some data, I want to do more research on this, greater and greater influence by the very wealthy. I mean, one good example, I don't know how many of you read over the last few days, a report that last year, the 25 most successful hedge fund managers earned $3 billion each on average. $3 billion each on average, 25 wealthiest. Now, they also pay a tax that is largely based upon capital gains. Their ordinary income, what you and I would consider to be their ordinary income, is actually, because of essentially a loophole in the tax laws, treated, for the most part, as capital gains, and for the most part, at a capital gains rate of 15%. $3 billion on average. 15%. Now, in this same article, now this was an article I believe, I should have cut it out. It's either the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. The last paragraph of that article, some of you may have seen it, said that President Obama had proposed getting rid of this loophole, but the Senate had essentially said no. Senate Democrats did not want to get rid of the loophole because of the political contributions, the campaign contributions that they might otherwise have to sacrifice.
Yeah.
Where is the public outcry? I mean, this seems to me inequality, just to pursue your point, you who are passing through. Thank you for coming. I mean, inequality has got to a point in this country, whether you're using Gini coefficients or just looking at the percentage of total income going to the top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1%, the top 10%. We have not seen this degree of inequality since the 1920s, and by some measures, since the days of the robber barons of the 1880s or 1890s. And there are all kinds of consequences here, not just in terms of the corruption of the political process, but also the public's faith and confidence that there is not collusion among the rich and the politically well-connected. The Tea Party movement is a right-wing movement, but believe me, there are a lot of people on the left who are just as angry about what they feel to be potential collusion going on. I think that at this rate, I don't want to overstate the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years the major division in this country was not Republicans versus Democrats, it was the establishment parties against this angry third-party movement.
I'm sorry, my finger's a little crooked. It wasn't you next, it was the woman in front of you. And yes, you, right there. There's the mic.
Thank you. Loved your talk. Thank you very much. But I did want to get back to...
I'm sorry, can you just identify yourself before you start?
My name's Patricia Hudson. Yeah. I wanted to get back to campaign finance reform because I agree with you that there's no other way to end what you, I think, very vividly describe as a lobbying arms race. So I'm just wondering if you could try to envisage what it would take, what sort of crisis it would take to gather support around campaign finance reform again. And secondly, as with the long and tortured healthcare reform, I'm constantly surprised that we don't look outside the United States for best practices on how to reform the financing of campaigns. I'm thinking particularly of how Western European countries have tried to clean up that particular process.
Well, the second part of your question, why don't we look outside the United States for best practices, is pretty clear. Anybody who has spent time in Washington knows that the way to immediately lose the attention of any group of policymakers, especially elected, is to say, I want to tell you how they do it in blank. There's an extraordinary conceit and arrogance with regard. I mean, look at healthcare. We had a lot of evidence from all over the world about what other countries were doing, even just north of our border, and we would not consider that evidence. Again and again and again. The evidence was right there, and nobody wanted to talk about it or utilize it. In terms of the kind of crisis that would bring about campaign finance, I mean, the standard answer to that is another scandal. The problem with waiting for another scandal is that the scandals deal not so much with what is legal, and that is the escalation, the arms race that I'm talking about. They deal with bribes, outright bribes, a gift, a token. This is such small potatoes relative to the real corruption. And how do you get the public to focus on the real corruption? It takes political leadership. I mean, like everything else, it's a combination of political leadership and grassroots, and I mean grassroots concern. It may be that at some point, I don't know that Obama and the Obama administration will itself exert this kind of influence, but if I'm correct about this wellspring of anger against the political system that I see welling up, partly because of inequality, partly because of the bad economy, that may prompt some real reform efforts to preempt it.
Francis Cam. I just wanted to ask, I was getting a little confused as to where the real push was. I mean, you represent it as coming from the differentiation of competing elements, right, as opposed to oligarchy. And presumably you think there was something good about competition coming in instead of oligarchy. You wouldn't think overall that we were in better shape under the oligarchic system.
I mean, oligopolies, the big...
oligopolies.
It's oligarchic
right.
too, but it's
whatever,
oligopolistic.
right.
Yes.
You wouldn't think we were better under, overall, people were better under that system. So there was something beneficial about moving to the increased competitive model, right?
Well, I think there's a trade-off. I don't want to say clearly we're better off. I mean, there were...
Is trust in government, which may have been diminished by this, the greatest good? In other words, are you placing more emphasis on, let's say, more emphasis on there being a trusting relationship between citizens and their government than on any other economic or other benefits that may have arisen out of the factors that led to decrease in trust?
No,
because that's going to play an
I'm not
important part in
suggesting.
this argument.
Excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt you,
Okay,
but I want
yeah.
to clarify.
Yeah.
I am not suggesting that we revert back to an oligopolistic system or we reduce competition. No, I'm suggesting that we don't have to make that choice. We can, through reform of campaign finance, through creating a safe zone and putting up, as I've suggested in supercapitalism and in this paper and elsewhere, a better boundary around our democratic process, keeping money at bay. We can have the best of both worlds. We can have a very dynamic, very competitive economy. Hopefully, we can overcome inequality or make at least some major steps toward doing that. And at the same time, we can keep money out of politics.
Okay, so
there is not... Right. I'm not at all suggesting we go back to
So
the
that's
days
a
of
very
oligopoly.
optimistic view. One question I had was, if we couldn't have everything, in the best of all possible worlds, which of these values is most important in a democracy? I'm not saying that I know the answer to that,
Yeah.
but it seemed to me part of the argument, that has to take place if we couldn't get the best of all worlds is that. But my second question was that you said that you didn't think politicians were more corrupt now than they had ever been, okay? And yet one way to look at the arms race is the other side, namely that the politicians are fueling the arms race because they found that they have something to offer the businesses who are competing. They can get money for offering it to them, changes in legislation. And this makes it seem like they are the truly, maybe this is something that you agree with, that they are the truly corrupt ones. So that it isn't, historically the businesses may have started it, but it's the government officials that may have found that this was their royal road.
Here's the great irony. I have not found a single politician who enjoys raising money, who enjoys the arms race. In 2002, some of you may remember, this is a gubernatorial level. It doesn't really pertain exactly the same way to my other themes, but I ran for the Democratic primary here in Massachusetts for governor, and I spent 5 hours a day, 6 days a week for 11 months on the telephone trying to raise money. Now, I did not enjoy that process. I don't know anybody running for office who likes raising money. Many politicians would like to have some sort of campaign finance option, but let me tell you something also that is ironic. Most business executives don't like pouring money into Washington. They don't like having these great lobbying firms and all of the government relations personnel. They think it's unrelated to their core business. They think of it as an irritant. They're angry about it. So who benefits? The only people who seem to benefit are the people in the middle, the lobbyists and the public relations interface, who are really, and I've seen this again and again, and I don't want to suggest that they are to blame anyway. This is not I'm not making a moral point. I'm just saying that their economic livelihoods are dependent on growing their businesses. And they grow their businesses essentially by rainmaking. And how do you rainmake? You go to businesses and you say, if you sign up with us, we can achieve this and this for you as we did for this firm. And they are very close to, they would never adapt this word, but they're very close to extortionists. Because what they're saying to one company or one segment of one industry is, if you do not sign up with us, we're going to your competitors and they will sign up with us.
Okay, so we've got a long queue. Bud is next.
My name is Arnold Relman. I used to be at the Harvard Medical School. I believe at one point in your talk, which I enjoyed enormously and learned a lot from, you hinted that you might say something about the corrupting effect of money on the professions, but you never got around to that. I realize that you had a lot of important other things to say. Are you inclined to take a minute to say something about this subject?
I can see it's
inclined
point 8 on your speech.
If you're
right here.
inclined to stay and listen for a minute, I will. And let me just hint at what I was going to say, Arnold. A piece of my paper, I raise what I talk about as the putting your money where your mouth is, or putting your mouth where your money is paradox. A lot of politicians will say that what I am voting for is what I believe in, and I am simply getting money from the industries or from the groups that like what my values are. I'm not being bought. They are simply supporting me because that's what I believe in. That becomes very hard to justify as you examine the details of the kinds of clauses they vote for and don't vote for. But we see a similar thing on the professional side. We have huge conflicts of interest in almost every profession. In the medical profession, I understand you've had several lectures about potential conflicts of interest. We have lawyers and accountants and financiers who have clients, and they are supposed to, because of the nature of their profession, these lawyers and accountants and financiers, they have a public obligation, not simply to advise their clients on how to do something that is marginally legal or in a gray area or maybe illegal, but they don't think they would advise their clients, they don't think they're going to get caught. They have an obligation to the public as professionals to tell their clients, no, you cannot do that. But the intensifying competition is driving many professionals to compromise their professional integrity for fear that they will lose the account if they don't pander to a particular client. The intensifying competition can be seen. Atul Gawande did a lovely piece in the New Yorker about comparing two cities, one in Texas and one in Colorado. Why did the Texas city have so much higher medical rates? Partly because the doctors owned the hospitals, because there was an intense culture of high-stakes competition in which every doctor essentially said, there's a lot of money to be made if we take a controlling position in all of these hospitals and specialists and healthcare facilities, and we prescribe like mad, we can make a bundle. In contrast to Grand Junction, Colorado, if my memory serves me, in which the doctors said, no, we're not going to get in that high-stakes competition game. We're going to put the interest of our patients first and our public interest also first. That is our public responsibility. We are not going to have, we're going to have not-for-profit hospitals. We're going to work together as teams. We're going to set rates in a way that is not particularly competitive. We are going to treat our patients in a kind of holistically, and we're going to keep down rates because we're going to focus on preventive medicine. Well, it's another in a long line of stories. If I had had time, I would have contrasted Al Gore and the difficulty he got into when he's testifying before the Congress about the importance of making energy investments with public money, when he has invested his own money in energy, that is alternative energy. He's roundly criticized. Well, is that wrong? He's putting his money where his mouth is. In fact, you could say he's sincere. One piece of evidence on his sincerity is he's investing his own money. But to contrast that with Peter Galbraith, a former ambassador who was roundly criticized because he has for years been in favor of Kurdish autonomy, helped draft the Kurdish constitution, which gave Kurdistan some power and autonomy over its oil fields. But then it comes out, not through public disclosure, through investigative reporters, that Peter Galbraith, prior to that time, had an agreement with a Norwegian oil company that gave Peter Galbraith a huge percentage of the returns from an oil field in Kurdistan. Now, which is corrupt? Is it Al Gore or is it Peter Galbraith? Which enhances public confidence or which doesn't? Which professional or which politician is putting his money where his mouth is or his mouth where his money is? And how do you tell the difference? Well, it's a very interesting and important set of issues, but I don't have time to get into it.
Okay, so we have a question here, then we have Charles, Frank, and Mazarine, and that will be it.
Hello, I'm Ben Klass, and in this talk you're talking about how really business managers should be on our side against the lobbyists. Elsewhere you've been in support of the Shareholder Protection Act and getting rid of corporate personhood. Can you explain how these different ideas of going after corporate money fit together?
I wish I could have heard the first part of your question better. I heard corporate personhood.
Okay, so I guess there's three parts that I'm seeing. The first is, within this talk, you were talking about how CEOs, some CEOs supported the McCain-Feingold bill. So in that sense, you're saying that business managers should also be against the power of lobbyists. In other places, you've talked about supporting the Shareholder Protection Act, which empowers shareholders to limit the power of business managers. And you've, in other places, said another way of bring this and down at reducing corporate influence is by removing the concept of corporate personhood. And I'm wondering how those three ideas fit together.
Well, they fit together, and I don't have quite the time to spin the entire framework. But what the Supreme Court did in Citizens United against Federal Election Commission was exactly the opposite of what I and others have been advocating for years, and that is they not only assume that corporations are people, but that corporations as people have First Amendment rights. But even with Citizens United, there is, as some of you remember, a case, McConnell against the Federal Election Commission, again, if my memory serves me correctly, in which this, and Citizens United did not overrule McConnell. And McConnell is the most important case, because in McConnell, the court said there is a public interest that potentially overrides the First Amendment interest, where there is the actual reality or the appearance of corruption. Aha! The appearance of corruption. Well, that is a potential road, it seems to me, if you followed my argument, because it's all about the appearance of corruption. There's nothing illegal about any of the campaign contributions that I've been talking about. But where there's an appearance of corruption, and there is an appearance of corruption, it seems to me that we can regulate speech. Now, going one step further, I think that disclosure laws are one of the ways we've tried to deal with corporate money in politics. We might want to consider the opposite. What do I mean? Suppose there were a law that said that every contribution that comes from anybody, including a PAC or including corporate CEOs and executives, including 527 contributions, any of those contributions from anybody has got to be put into a blind trust for the candidate. And the candidate, and nobody around his candidate, nobody may ever know who contributed what. Thereby, automatically severing the quid from the quo. So there are a number of, I have some suggestions in the paper, but there are many, people have been working on this for quite some time. I think it's less a problem of coming up with the ideas than it is a problem of political will.
Charles Fried. If politicians so hate raising money, can you explain why the system of public finance, which is in place, has been in place for a quarter of a century, has been such a failure? And in respect to presidential campaigns, the amount of financing has not been thought to be all that inadequate, and yet it's dead. How come? What killed it?
It's inadequate because it doesn't keep up with the amount of money that a candidate believes he or she can make by soliciting individual contributions. Not in some cases. McCain obviously bought into public financing. Obama did not, because Obama believed he could do better. We need a public financing law that says, regardless of how much your opponent solicits and gets, the public financing agency or fund will match it dollar for dollar. In other words, that neutralizes any incentive on the part of any candidate in a general election to solicit private financing. Otherwise, there's always going to be a candidate that says there's not enough public financing.
Frank?
I'm Frank Michaelman. I think I'm just maybe summing up what's been said, but let me try it. to me that after all is said and done here, that what you presented to us is a kind of quadrangulated problem. You start with oligopoly versus competitive markets, and other things being equal, we would prefer competition. But then you get to not unregulated competition. We have the next angle is regulation versus deregulation, and other things being equal, you and I, at least, would prefer regulation. Then the third angle is arms race versus arms control. And there you make the kind of neat move of arguing that arms control is the key to being able to have both competitive markets under these new structural competitions and regulation, right? Responding to Francis Kemp. And then I'm sitting here thinking, but there's a fourth angle. And the fourth angle is unrestricted free political association and action, as opposed to government-controlled political association and action, or, in other words, the First Amendment, which put in an appearance here very late in the proceedings. But it seems to me, if you take it through the first three steps, then the fourth step is really crucial. And what I was actually going to say before I heard the blind trust idea, which I hadn't actually heard before, probably because I haven't been reading your books the way I should have been, I was going to say that I haven't yet heard any proposal for arms control through government regulation that wouldn't raise, given existing First Amendment doctrine and the existing composition of the Supreme Court, that wouldn't raise a very serious First Amendment problem. Not saying that there are no theories that I know how to argue to save them, but the way things are, it's a really tough row. So I suppose it just identifies my own professional vocation, that after having heard the whole thing develop, it seems to me that a lot of pressure is coming to rest on a legal question.
Well, a lot of pressure does come to rest on the First Amendment question, but it seems to me even greater pressure comes down on the question of political will, because you can have arms control through either the form of public financing that I suggested to Charles, or through my cockamamie idea of a blind trust, or perhaps other ways that are completely consistent, it seems to me, with Citizens United against Federal Election Commission. You're not so sure, Frank. Well, I would say that they are consistent, but the greatest hurdle, to my mind, is getting the political will, mobilizing the political will to do it. If I'm correct about this being an arms race, and correct about corporate America not really wanting to continue with this arms race because it erodes profits or certainly money that could otherwise be used for something else or going to shareholders, that there may be some possibility of striking an arms control deal. That's what arms control is all about.
I apologize we've gone so long, but I've really wanted to hear everything you've said. One last question from Mazarine, and then we're going to stop.
Thank you very much for the clarity of your ideas. I especially liked hearing about the alternative theories, one of which is the one that says blame the Republicans. And as somebody who studies the corruption in every human being's mind, I am with you when you say that this is not so simple and that we've got as many bad actors or bad apples in one group as the other. But don't you feel that given the fact that these issues end up being ones that favor a particular ideology over others, that there ought to be some difference between those who sit slightly to the left of the middle versus to the right of the middle? So just recently I read something about how 78% of money from these financial investment firms is going to go to Republican candidates, for example. And I assume that in moments like this, there would be a way for the two parties to actually look a little bit different than they do. And so I just wanted you to say something about why it isn't the case that the differences in ideology ought to actually make the Democrats, or anybody who's slightly to the left of the center, let alone being radical, end up being the champions of the positions that we all care about.
Well, I would love to say that I've seen a substantial difference between Democrats and Republicans on the issue we're talking about. That is, the solicitude or the willingness and desire to solicit or accept money from the corporate and private sector for the purpose of helping with campaigns. I don't see a great deal of difference. They are drinking at the same trough most of the time. Now, you just pointed out something very important, and that is there is a major financial institution trade association and Jamie Dimon and a few others, Jamie Dimon being the head of J.P. Morgan Chase, that have gone to Democrats and gone to Republicans, say to the Democrats, if you don't shape up, if you don't stop blasting us, right after the president called them fat cats, this happened, we are going to shift the preponderance of our contributions to Republicans. Until that point, I mean, in the last election cycle, in the 2006 election cycle, in 2004, Wall Street has been an equal opportunity benefactor. It has been very careful to provide money to both parties. Different banks, again, are aligned slightly differently with different parties, not out of ideology, but out of connections and also what they've done. Citibank, for example, has been extremely friendly to the Democrats, as has Goldman Sachs. Why? Because, do we need to go into it? Okay.
With that non-word, we can end this. Thank you very much, Robert Reich.
Thank you. Oh, thanks.